Good evening. I'd like to call this November 10, 2021 Joint Council and Planning Commission special meeting to order. We're going to revise the order of the agenda and take the roll call, pledge of allegiance, and invocation before public comment. I'd like to point out that this meeting is being hosted through live stream on the city's website and by Zoom for public comment. Due to the structure of this meeting, I would like to remind council and commissioners to have their microphones turned on and positioned so that the audience can hear. City Clerk, may we have a roll call, please?
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Councilmember Brown. Here. Councilmember Krupa.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Lowenthal.
Here.
Mayor Meyer is absent. Commissioner Hill.
Here.
Commissioner Lemke is absent. Commissioner Beamsterber. Here. Vice Chair Van Arsdale.
Here.
Chairman Worth is absent.
Chairman Worth is attending via Zoom.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, Mayor Pro Tem, I'd like to make a motion to excuse Carla Meyer.
Second. All in favor? And Cindy Lemke.
I'll second.
Favor? Okay. Motion approved to excuse everyone absence. So we're going to do the invocation now. I'm going to do the invocation now, and then it's going to be followed by Councilmember Brown with the pledge of allegiance. Father, we thank you for tonight. We thank you for being in our midst and giving us the intelligence to hear out what we're going to hear out and continue to be a blessing to the city. I thank you for being tonight with us as we gather together. In the name of Jesus, amen.
Everyone, please face the flag. It's on the wrong side. Fix that. Ready? Begin.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
There's a 3-minute per person time limit for all general public comments. All who wish to speak, including council members, planning commissioners, and staff, need to be recognized by the Mayor Pro Tem before speaking. So we'll take public comment for this item or for the item listed on the agenda. Yeah.
Mr. Mayor, there are no registered public comments.
Are there any members of the public participating through Zoom that would like to comment on any discussion item?
Mr. Mayor, there are no public comments on the Zoom call.
Okay, so then we will move into our first discussion item, 6A work study, to discuss the 6th cycle housing element update 2021 through 2029. Who will be giving the staff report on this item?
The presentation will be given by Kim, Morning Representative. We can present. Excellent. Thank you, Mayor Morton, members of the City Council and Planning Commission. It's great to be here this evening. This is the culmination of a process that you are continuing through early part of 2022. We wanted to come back to you to give you a status report on the status of the housing element and the next steps we go through, and we have some good news for you in some cases, and some of the details of the plan that we want to discuss with you. We have a short presentation and we want to allow you plenty of time to have dialogue and discussion and provide guidance and direction to the staff as we go through the process. But as we look at the agenda here On the screen, we have a number of items that we want to talk with you this evening. The first being the background of the process of what got us to here today, and the step-by-step that we've gone through to develop a draft document. An important part of the process is the engagement with your residents and stakeholders, and we want to talk through how we engage your public into the process and listen to their concerns and how that's reflected in the document itself. One of the challenges that every city has is the identification of candidate sites or adequate sites to accommodate future housing growth. So we go through a complicated process to identify those opportunities that you have within your jurisdiction and identify those as viable options to accommodate your growth in the coming 8 years. The core or the foundation of the plan itself is the goals, policies, and program actions. So if you think as the two bodies, the council and the commission, this is what you would use on a day-to-day basis to provide consistency with the overall housing goals of the community. There is a lot of new laws and new regulations that we'll talk about that will influence what you have to do and what you should do and how the state's expectations that. And then we have the next steps that we'll talk about, which is as we go on after this evening, the process of working with the state to review the housing element for compliance with state law, and ultimately coming back for the Planning Commission for a recommendation to the City Council's action in early 2022. So with that, I wanted to turn it over briefly to Ines Galmiche, who will provide you a summary of our presentation, and we'll both be here to answer any questions or clarifications that we have. So with that.
All right, so I'll give you a little background on the housing element update and why we update it. You're already a bit familiar with it, but just a little brief. So the housing element updates are required by law to be updated every 8 years to show the city's ability to continue meeting housing needs. And the housing element updates process is also a good time for the city to engage with the community, to receive feedback from residents and stakeholders on their ability to access housing as well as develop housing. The housing element updates also establishes policies and programs that address the city's housing needs. And these have to be, the housing element has to be certified by the Department of Housing and Community Development, HCD, to ensure compliance with those state laws. So speaking of state laws, we have just a few of the very many new bills that have been passed recently here on the screen. We won't go too much into detail, but there are quite a lot that the housing elements needs to comply with. And that ranges from streamlining review processes for certain developments, as well as ADU measures. And a new part of the 6th cycle housing element update process is to address affirmatively furthering fair housing, or AFH as we call it. And that is to protect communities against being overburdened and making sure that housing is distributed throughout the community. And that housing also takes into, new housing also takes into consideration access to resources, transportation and employment nearby, as well as the availability of a variety of housing types at different affordability levels. So the housing element is made up of 4 main sections and then 4 more technical appendices. The first section is more of an introduction to the elements. The second section gives a population and housing profile. So those are demographics on the community, as well as housing, looking at potential housing needs there. Then we've got section 3, which is an evaluation of housing constraints and resources. Constraints, we look at non-governmental as well as governmental constraints. The non-governmental can include the cost to build housing, or the cost of land, and then governmental can be the review processes or development fees, as well as AFFH, as I just mentioned. And then we've got section 4, which as Dave mentioned is the groundwork for the housing elements and establishes the policies, the programs, and the goals to achieve the city's goals. And then for the appendices, we've got a review of past performance. So we look at the current housing elements, policies and programs, see what needs to change, what was successful, and what was completed. We have an analysis of the identified candidate sites, and we'll go a bit more into depth on those sites in a few slides. And then we've got community outreach summary and a glossary of housing terms. So community engagement. The city has held a number of community engagement opportunities since the start of the housing element update process. We've had 2 community workshops virtually. We did outreach to community stakeholders. With this study session, we've had 2 joint sessions. We've also had the public review draft available to the public for feedback between September 24th and October 24th. And we also have the webpage with that public review draft available, background information on the housing element update process, and any upcoming engagement opportunities for the public to be aware. So now the meat of the candidates of the housing elements, our sites. So the housing element has to identify exact sites throughout the city that will be able to accommodate the city's 2021 to 2029 arena allocation. There's a variety of factors that go into the selection of these sites, and this can include existing infrastructure, resources, access to transportation, and the City of Hemet's housing elements, draft housing elements, has identified the projected development of ADUs and existing vacant residential zone properties as a way to meet the arena allocation. So as you see here on the screen, we'll start at the top. The first line shows the arena allocation. So there's about a little under 6,500 total sites that the city needs to be able to accommodate for. And the City of Hemet is quite unique in that it has a lot of current projects ongoing right now seeking entitlements that we are able to take credit for. So just under 5,000 units can be counted through this process. And those, just those alone, we can check off above moderate income, the above moderate income reallocation, as well as a number of the lower income RENA units. So then to meet the remaining RENA allocation, we identified existing vacant residentially zoned properties that have capacity as it stands now to meet the remaining RENA allocation. So that's about a little over 3,700 sites that won't require any rezoning, no changes at all. Just as they are now, they can accommodate sufficient housing units for RENA.
Sorry, we said just under 5,000 presently qualifying.
3,787.
Okay, so that's under 4,000.
Yes. Yep. And then in addition, the state allows us to, they developed a methodology for us to project a certain number of ADUs to be developed over the next 8 years. And so we estimate about 88 units over the next 8 years will be developed. So as you see at the bottom, the housing element identifies approximately just under 9,000 units to have capacity to be developed within the city, so that's a buffer of over 2,000 units. It's important for us to include a buffer for the RENA allocation as this allows for certain sites to develop slightly under what we estimated would be developed there. So if any sites were to develop less than what the maximum is, the city is still on track to meet its reallocation without having to choose new sites. And then this is a little small for you to see, but you'll see it more clearly in Appendix B of the housing element. The point of the map is to show you that the sites that we've identified are fairly well scattered throughout the city. No one particular area is more overburdened with sites than another. The larger yellow parcels, those are pipeline projects. So sites that are currently seeking entitlement for housing units. So as with all elements of the city's general plan, the housing element has a number of goals, policies, and programs. And the point of these is to address housing needs of the community as well as state requirements. So we have 5 housing goals identified through the housing elements. These are all the same goals from your existing housing elements, so they haven't changed. And these are to provide for quality housing for all members of your community, facilitate the provision of affordable housing and preserving affordable housing opportunities, providing adequate sites for housing, as well as preserving and rehabilitating existing neighborhoods. And so within each of these goals, we identify a number of programs to address housing needs, as well as the state requirements, as we just mentioned. And within the new state laws, there are a number of additional policy programs that have to be added to meet state requirements. We won't go too much into depth with these topics. These are just a handful of the new programs that we need to address through the housing elements. And so that includes facilitation of ADUs throughout the community, streamlining methods, allowing for emergency shelters, transitional and supported housing, and low barrier navigation centers, as well as allowing for housing for persons with development disabilities and addressing any constraints that might appear there. And we have some more here, and so that's continues on to farm worker housing, funding and voucher programs for the community and residents, updated density bonuses, removing development constraints that have been identified throughout the housing element updates process, as well as addressing fair housing. Here you have an example of one of the policy programs. This one is specifically to be in compliance with the RENA allocation. But this is just to show you that all of the programs they'll have their own title, and then they'll have a detailed description of what the program is seeking to address, what exactly it will do. And each program must also include timing. So when is this program going to be addressed by? The responsible agency to address the program, as well as the funding source. So now next steps. So we submitted the first draft of the housing element to HCD on October 27th for their first review. They have 60 days, so through December, to review the document and then come back to us with any comments, any edits they would like to see, their thoughts on how we address all of the needs in the community. We'll revise the elements, make those edits, and the city will adopt the housing elements and then send the adopted documents to HCD for certification. We are currently on track. We're meeting the schedule. The documents, their original due dates, the due date is in October, but there's a 120-day grace period. So they have to be submitted to HCD by February 12th, and we're on track to meet that and have the city adopt the housing elements by those states. In addition, we're also having to update the safety elements and the environmental justice elements. We don't have any updates on those for you tonight, but we are planning on a community workshop in January, February, early 2022. So we'll keep you updated as soon as we have more information about that. And that's it for tonight. That was a lot of information, but we'll gladly take your questions and any comments, feedback you might have.
I have a question regarding the list of items for preservation, and one of them was the mobile home parks. Have you engaged directly with mobile home park owners here? We have, I think, 23 or 25 mobile home parks and subdivisions. And is there an element in there that talks about them separately? Because we have rental parks and then we have own your own lot subdivisions of mobile homes.
We do include some information in section 3 on mobile homes. We have not outreach to them directly, though we have made the documents available to the whole community, as well as with the workshops and other engagement opportunities.
Many of the parks here are quite old, and they are and have been facing infrastructure, the old infrastructure problems and improvements that need to be done. For example, one on the west side of town had an electrical problem throughout. So they, those kind of upgrades, I guess I would ask if the state has required the preservation of them, are they providing any funding or long-term financing for the owners?
That's a good question. I might defer to Dave on that.
That's all the $1 million question literally is, where the money's coming from. We're seeing a lot of movement on, because the housing process, we've seen a lot more burden on local government to provide for the housing. And so there's two pieces. There's a carrot and the stick. The carrot is really funding and the availability of financing, especially to accommodate that. So that is in the process. You'll probably see that in the next few years. There's a lot of trickle down coming from the federal government based on, with the pandemic and the results of that. So there's some trickle down that's coming. In addition, the stick is that the state is complying us more to accommodate that. So the local governments have to do a better job, or the expectation is do a better job to help to facilitate that. So not just getting the funding from somewhere else, but what is the city doing to help to facilitate that? There is no exact answer to that question today, but certainly the pots of monies are emerging at this time, and probably in the next few years you'll see those realities come to fruition.
Hello. So you talked about the community outreach, but you didn't give us any indication what the feedback was from that community outreach. Do you have anything from those sessions?
We do, yes. So Appendix C of the housing element contains all of the information, summaries on the outreach that we've done.
But basically, if you had to pick the top 2 items that they talked about, what would they be?
What did we have? We had availability. We had some availability to resources, comments, making sure housing was in areas that are near community resources. Let's see, the availability of jobs near housing as well. Pride in ownership, so ownership opportunities. A lot of comments on availability of jobs, rental rates, so affordability of housing as well.
if I could comment on that, the affordability issue is, if you think of the foundation of where all of the issues come from, a lot of it has been founded in the discussion that we had with public. And they're all recorded, so if you had some time, you could hear what they actually said. But it's really the affordability becomes a reaction to all the other things. So you have the issue of saying is, on one end of it is, how do I get from being a renter to an owner? And then when I'm in my community, I want to be able to grow up here and my kids to grow up here, to sustain here. And so as I grow through the spectrum of life, you graduate college, you get your first apartment, you know, like my sister had her first apartment here in Heaven. The ability to buy that first home when you're newly married, once your kids go away and you retire, what can you move down into a smaller size? And so that the affordability is not just today, but through the cycle of somebody's life that they can actually have those opportunities. So that choice dynamic was a part of the discussion you had, is what are the different choices I have for housing throughout the course of, not just today, but into the future.
Okay. So does this community feedback get into the first draft report to the HCD?
Yes, it is.
It does.
Yeah.
Okay. And you talked about the HCD, you submitted the first draft, they have until December something to get back. Any indication about any other cities that have submitted theirs for the first draft? What can we expect back from the HCD?
I just had this discussion. Do you know what a Rube Goldberg machine is? There you go. And I'm being silly, but there is, because there's so many new laws that have come out, the governor just signed 30+ new housing related laws 3 weeks ago. And if we go back from 2017, it's over 100. And each one of those has to be addressed. And so the challenge that you have in policy when it comes from the state is they'll say, make diligent efforts. You define that versus you define that. It's different. So there's a subjectivity to a law, which makes it challenging to see what exactly, fits correctly, right? The biggest issue that we're seeing is in the affirmatively furthered fair housing is that what was some thought of as in the beginning as a very simple process has become very complex and complicated when we're looking at areas of affluence and access to opportunity on education, racial and ethnic concentrations in the community, how that relates to how you choose your sites and all that. So you have a 60+ page section in here that we have to do all these maps and all this analysis. And that's what the state is not sure what they know, what they want. So we're seeing that there's a lot of back and forth that is occurring, especially on that fair housing issue. And then in addition, that the sites issue is becoming quite important because a lot of the development is infill, lower affordable units. You have the luck of having sites available. So your discussion about the viability of growth and opportunities is not a harder burden because you have the actual sites already within your general plan to accommodate that. So we'll see if that sticks, but that's a good position to be in.
So do you foresee the arena numbers changing at all?
They won't change.
They won't change?
No.
Okay. So I assume the city attorneys looked over the report before it began.
I have been in contact with staff throughout this entire process, and it's actually one of the reasons why I know I've talked to the planning commission about our new assistant city attorney who was at our last meeting, who has extensive housing experience. She's actually watching the meeting tonight. She's excited to continue this process in the next year.
Okay. Appreciate it. Thank you.
I have a question which I think is in the process of being answered, but has council seen what you sent to HCD?
So I'll jump in on this one. It looks like the items are on the city's website, so we'll make sure that we include the link for everybody that's here so that you can see all of the information that they're talking about tonight.
Just a comment. it would have been nice to have had that link so we could have seen what we were talking about tonight and have questions formulated.
I agree with you.
So as you know, and we had in our discussion before when you were here, the fact that Hemet has generally been a much more affordable, not just us, but certainly San Jacinto too, affordable area. So we look at all the rules and regulations that we are following. I'm assuming that the county, because, excuse me, we have adjacency of a southeast area of about 25 to 30,000 people. That's county. So I'm assuming that county is going through the same process as we speak and has the same deadlines. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay, so in our last discussion, we talked about the fact that Hemet does have a much more affordable numbers, although this last probably year, we've been catching up, I guess, when it came to the pricing of housing in the region because of demand. It seems like since we met last, there's been quite a movement both in rental rates and housing prices. How does that factor in, that affordability factor? And what does that do to cities like us?
So most of the data that we include in our community profile on the housing stock comes from the census. So that doesn't account for more recent changes due to pandemic and just more recently. But that is information that we to consider as well.
I just don't want to see us submit, and if we depended on the census and it's much lower in comparison to what the market has done, I don't want them to come back and look and say you didn't do your job and the housing's gone out of control when it comes to pricing. And it's not just us, it's everybody around us too.
Yeah, in how we determine affordability in those income categories, whatever that may be, is based on a percentage of the county's median income. So you in the collection with the county, say the county median income for 2021 is 77,500. Well, next year in February, it may be 78,000 or 80,000, or it could be 70,000. Depends on the market dynamic. So that's how they use the determination of what that affordability is. Then you have the market dynamic that comes in to push that. And so you may have an occasion where the inflation, if you will, of housing prices is going to affect folks because they're going to have to not be able to afford things that they used to be able to afford because of that change in the median family income. That determines what that affordability is. It changes every year.
And our median income is substantially lower than what
Right.
the region is. A big factor in that is certainly our retirees.
Yes.
We always argue that our retirees don't have car payments and kid payments and all of that. So they have a much more spendable income, even though their income is lower. So does that skew us in anything, or do you just stick with the county's average numbers?
We're obligated by state law to stick with that, but the point that you just made is valid. It's because when you look at the average, you may have lower incomes on average in your community in comparison to the region. So in a sense, there's a penalty, if you will, that people can't afford it and they need to catch up to what that median is in the county. So it's a common occurrence that you see in many cities and many counties where you may have the city of Riverside may have a much higher median income than the folks here in your community. What we do in the housing element is we identify that spectrum of your community and what it is outside of the RENA process. Because what we're saying is, here are the real people in your community that can afford it. Here's the affordability payments of the folks in your community. And we plan and accordingly provide housing opportunities or policies and programs that will encourage those for those folks in those income categories. So it's not ignored, but it's a consideration that we take through the policy plan to address them.
And those large number of mobile home parks, many of which are senior communities, but those large number of mobile home parks have helped to accommodate that lower income ratio because of the affordability factor there. So I don't know how much you looked at our mobile home parks and what they supplied for the housing affordability.
We do look at that, and HCD has acknowledged that they know that that's a pretty substantial share and a unique share in comparison to the whole region. And
Thank you.
Guys, can you hear me?
Go ahead, John.
I got a quick question for you. I'll go ahead and start this just so I feel like I'm involved there a little bit. But I'm sorry that I wasn't able to be there. Had a close or contact with someone with COVID, so opted to stay away. But understanding that there's a need to show the state that we're meeting our due diligence in meeting their requirements. One of the slides that you showed had the ADU numbers as part of, very small, and I'm wondering if you could maybe expand on what the basis for those numbers are. It seems like those numbers are very low based on what we currently have. And is that based on permits that are submitted? Is there a way to quantify maybe existing ADUs that may not be permitted in an effort to meet some of those numbers? I would venture to guess there's probably a lot of ADUs out there that may not necessarily have gone through the formal process. I noticed that those numbers seem to be very, very small.
yes, and the answer to the question is there's a process. And so with the state of California, there's a bunch of new ADU laws on the table. Essentially, it's by right for ADUs. And recently with SB 9 and all of that, that's just been passed signed by the governor, is ADUs are starting to become more and more of an option for affordability. What the state did is work with the Southern California Association of Governments to create a pre-approved process of identifying affordability levels of ADUs so we can make assumptions. So how we do that is, this is what the state law says we can do, is we look from 2018 to 2020. We get our average permits for ADUs, and we use that as an average number, and then we project that out over the planning period. So the total of 88 units is a reflection of your past performance in actual built ADUs in your community between 2018 and 2020. Now, that being said, cities say, well, if it's by right, we should have a larger opportunity to do that. But what the state says is your past performance is the guy that we would trust more to do that. And so we're limiting jurisdictions to use that average between 2018 and 2020 to determine that number. Now, the pre-approved methodology says that we can assign certain income categories for that 88 units based on a pre-approved formula that was approved by SCAG and HCD. So the 88 numbers is basically what the state will allow you to do. You can exceed that, and that will still count for credit for your planning period. And you have policies and other programs within your plan that encourage the development. So you can exceed that. I believe personally that because of the nature of ADUs and the ability for anybody to come in and do those, that we'll probably see a higher, steeper curve in the trend line. but that remains to be seen. But at this point, HDD uses it at 18 in 2020 as a basis.
Gotcha. So is there any approach available for, for going backwards and quantifying potential ADUs that may not have been permitted or gone through the formal process, to help meet some of those RENA numbers?
Yeah, so there is policy options. Is a legal ADU is exactly what it is. It's a legal ADU. So somebody would have to come to the city to get that to a legal status. So you could have a policy or a program within your plan that allows for folks to have, say, we'll call it a legal ADU to get into a legal status. That's a process they have to go through. Once you get that on the books, then you essentially have a real unit that you can count. Because at this point, we can't assume, in a policy we can create to say, okay, 5, 10, 20 units a year of these illegal units that we can bring to a legal status, but it won't necessarily affect the numbers that you have in the table that you've seen on the PowerPoint that we showed today.
It would not affect those numbers if we were able to go back and say, okay, well, we actually have, X number of ADUs that were previously not legal ADUs, but they went through the process and now they're legal. Would that not offset some of the need to increase some of the low income?
Assuming that you could identify those as being legal units.
So it would just be a basis of determining them as legal. So if the city had something in place that whereby maybe somebody who may have converted a garage, for example, into an apartment, and they wanted to bring that into a legal status, if the city had a mechanism by which to do that, then we could include that as an additional element for the RENA numbers compliance.
It would be an additional policy.
Gotcha.
Because we're looking forward when it comes to the, getting those to a legal status. So that would be a forward-looking thing. We can't, because of the statutory requirements, we can only use the those permits that have been finalized to count that. So if something came in subsequent that was finalized, we could count that as credit, if you will, for the RENA process.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question for you, and I think it was in your presentation. Did you mention homeless shelters and tiny homes?
So we did mention, I believe that was part of the policy program topics. So emergency shelters, transitional and supportive housing, as well as lower barrier navigation centers. And so those are policy programs that allow for those types of developments to be developed within certain zones in the city.
And do those count towards affordable housing? Or low income housing, low and mod? I mean, where does it fall on the spectrum, since basically it is providing housing?
It's a price point.
It's a what?
Essentially, it could be anything as long as the price point's there. So we can have single family as affordable. The issue comes into is the subsidy that it takes to bring it to market. When you have things like you had mentioned, tiny homes, if by virtue of the size of their tiny, the construction costs are less, so therefore, presumably the cost of the housing will be less. So you think of tiny homes, you think of mobile homes, you think of apartments, you think of all of that, each have different price points. You can make them affordable. It's a level of subsidy that you have to get to bring it to market. So.
And do those then count towards RENA numbers as far as housing units?
Yes.
They do.
Yes.
Because I was reading an article today about Seattle and the number of tiny home communities they have throughout the community, and those pose problems and issues as well. But it is something that, at least on a temporary basis, for helping homeless people get that hand up. But at the same time, I mean, you want to satisfy arena. I don't necessarily want to satisfy arena numbers because you know my personal opinion. But, you know, it is something that we have to look at. And if one of our, you know, nonprofits in our Valley Vista shelter goes in that direction, it would be nice to know that it actually comes towards numbers that Henry has to come up with.
And if I can clarify on when we talk about housing, a unit has to meet the census definition of a unit. And that is, it has its own entry. So it's a private entry to that, and you have kitchen and bath facilities. So for example, if you look at in Torrance, for example, they have those, you may have seen it on the news where they have these little boxes where people can sleep in a row. Well, those are shelters because they're not a census definition of a unit. They don't have the, you know, all the living facilities within it. So we have to distinguish between those different needs, although it meets the spectrum of your need in your community. To count it from a RENA standpoint and affordability, we have to think about that census definition.
Thank you.
Price point, when we're talking about tiny homes, we have to have an entry, kitchen, bathroom. There are tiny homes that have that. But when you say price point, what exactly is your definition of price point? Because I know affordable, but what's price point?
When we say affordability, it's the cost of the unit, whether it's a rental or a mortgage payment. So when we say price point, we just say, what is the actual cost of that unit? So any other type of unit, whether it be tiny homes, apartment, single family, the affordability is defined of how much you're paying for a rent or how much you're paying for a mortgage, if you will.
So what makes it okay then? So the cost of a tiny home is we're discussing what would make tiny home be a unit, be the cost point, the cost be approved. Do you have like a number?
That could vary. It depending on what level of affordability you define for that unit. If you want it to be extremely low, it's less than 30% of the median family income. So if you had, for example, extremely low income, less than 30%, whatever, let's say you had the 70,000 is your median family income, 30% would be 21,000. Affordability is based on about 30% of your income associated for housing costs. So take that 21,000 and do 30% of that, and that will give you kind of a thumb sketch of what an affordability by each of those income categories. Does that make sense?
And therein lies the problem in Kemet, because we have an average income of 38,000. And you go by a third of that, then you've got some much lower rates than might be available now. It could have been available 2 years ago, but they might be available now. So how do you meet that? And then second to that, regarding the tiny house thing that Linda and you were talking about, the RV parks, I question if they qualify as mobile home parks do, because they're permanent and you move into them and you're renting the space, but it's not mobile. We have a lot of spaces in our RV parks that would qualify because the structures that have been put on them for tiny homes. Golden Village Palms is a perfect example where they have put them in themselves and they rent those, they don't rent just the space. So I guess those two questions. One is, because of our average income being so much lower, does that make a difference in what we're going to be required as far as the numbers that you just asked about? Number two, would our RV parks qualify if they converted and put in a bunch of those smaller spaces, which they're very nice, but they qualify by your definition. And they would be good, safe environments because you have a clubhouse and a manager and all of that. So has RV park instead of mobile home park, has RV parks been any kind of part of the discussion?
Not directly, but I can tell you from a statewide standpoint that alternative housing options, whether it be reuse or reutilization of, say RV park or, single family, multifamily, whatever it may be, is these are viable options, because what the challenge that you have in your housing element policy is you're creating opportunities for those who live in your community. So let's separate from the state requirements of HCD requirements and focus on what is the actual need in your community. That's where section 2 of your housing element gets into the details, say, this is exactly what our community needs. The policy program should reflect that. And so when we look at your policy program, it's saying, what are the options and opportunities that we have to accommodate your community? You said the average is 38,000. I just did a thumbnail thing. That's about a monthly housing payment of $950. So if you think about that number and you go to Orange County, it's 3 times. Obviously, there's no options. Here, it's where do you find those options that people have to afford the $950 a month? Because that's essentially half your population is within that. So we have to plan for and look for ways and look at the zoning code and other things to say, what is the spectrum of opportunity that we can increase to further enhance the ability for those people to indicate it. And I know there was a second question you had in there. I wasn't sure if I got it correctly.
So what was this? I got into asking you a follow-up question to this if I could, and then I'll think about
Sure.
it.
HB, I think.
Yeah, if I can, the second question was, does the RV park qualify?
Correct. Yes.
That was their second question.
And the simple answer to that
Hang on to that.
is yes.
Okay, good. And then to follow on that 38,000, again, our dilemma in it has been that the 38,000, the lower income, has been caused by the retirement element that is in our community, which we really like a lot. And they behave and, don't call the police much. They call medics alerts, but not the police as much. So there's a really good factor that they bring to the community. But again, their lower income is often, and many of them own their own property. They don't have payments. So they could probably qualify to be, if they had payments and that was all factored in, they would probably pull us up to 50 to 60,000 average income here, because if you added all the things in there. That's why I just keep asking and thinking, do we have some special considerations when you have communities like ours that have that? They're not homeless. They don't have the need to rent. They own their own, mortgage free, oftentimes are very low. So we don't have the demand and need to accommodate them in larger numbers. So as you're saying, well, if people can't find housing for $950 a month, no, they can't, but there's a big number of them that don't need to because they own their own property. Is that making sense?
Yes.
Yeah, it seems to me that I'm just looking at one of the slides of your presentation. I counted no less than 28 bills related to housing, and then it says and more.
Yeah, there's plenty more.
And so I guess my exasperation with this whole topic is that it's like trying to hit a moving target. They pile, it's like the rules of golf. They never delete any rules. They just add new ones in. And they just keep compounding and making it more and more complex. And it's a fluid situation because of all the things that we've already talked about with
changes in the economy and the changes in home prices and changes of the cost of building materials. So it's such a fluid situation. I get so exasperated that the government tries to nail local government down to some finite number that we're supposed to have to make this fantasy land. And I'm sorry if I sound negative about it, but it's just, it's government at its worst, I think, in my opinion, because it's not really addressing the real issues. It's become an industry unto itself to rate these bills and hire professional consultants to help us interpret how do we maneuver all these bills. And yet the fact of the matter is we have a very legitimate question posed by a planning commissioner that says it's not a one size fits all. Hemet is a different kind of a community than Anaheim, which is different than LA, which is different than San Francisco. So that's where my frustration comes in all of this, that we have a number, we try to get a hold of that number, and then things change. And as we've said before, cities don't build homes. We provide opportunities, and that's what this is trying to get to, I guess, but we don't build homes. And we don't tell people where to live and how to live. So it seems that within this 28 some odd bills, there's got to be some mechanism for special consideration and tabulating what the real objective is for the city. So I'll get on my soapbox. I'm probably preaching to the choir anyhow. I do have one question on the price point. When you talk about the cost, is that the cost of construction, or what is the sales price of it?
The sales price,
Sales.
and what the actual cost of going on the resident of the property.
And to Lori's point, there a lot of the places, a lot of the mobile home, not mobile home parks, but the RV parks are transitioning their spaces because there's been kind of an evolution of RVers who used to be full-time RVers, and they've sold their RV and invested in a park model, which is constructed on what used to be an RV site. So it's not mobile, it's a permanent structure. So I think that's a very valid question that we should be able to consider those in the county.
Not to be morbid, but to add to the retirement component in our ballot. When retirees leave a retirement community, it's generally because they passed on, oftentimes because they passed away, which is an interesting element when we did the Housing for Older Persons Act in Washington, because Hemet is the sponsor of that bill, and we got that passed way back in the 90s. One of the components that we talked about often was the fact that that in and of itself is not like a community like Anaheim or a lot of these communities where there's such a lower number of retirees, because when somebody moves, they've got to move somewhere else. Here, that space opening up permanently moves people in that are now becoming retirees as they reach that age. And so that moves the line, and it helps to lessen the problem of housing shortage. Does that make sense? Because that, when retirees leave us permanently, is that politically correct? When they check out, there you go. The checking out procedure it leaves a movement that is helpful in the community, that moves everybody. It could be moved up, or so there's that difference that I don't know if that's ever been taken into consideration in housing element issues and housing thoughts and what you need to supply. Because in Hemet, that could mean that we have more housing available just simply because of that. And then they're making us build a whole bunch more, and maybe we don't have to as much. I don't know how to plug that one in. Linda, help me.
You want to put me on that list?
Well, I'm getting there too, so when we first started this 30 years ago, I kept wondering why I was doing it, but now I know I want a place to go. So anyway, so that, I don't know if that's ever been brought up, but that is something that we had talked about years ago, and then I think it is something that is a component of retirement, of areas that have high retirement.
I don't know if I can follow up on that one.
I have a real quick question or comment. I mean, it seems that, you know, like all of this discussion is, you know, centered around the uniqueness of Hemet relative to what the state requirements are. And I think, you know, probably every city within the state is at least, if not making the same case, experiencing the same issues. Is there any opportunity for the city to present this to the state, or is it just simply because of the structure and the laws and the funding, you know, if that we have no option? Is there any purpose in even like pursuing this? Is there any opportunity for the city to go to the state and say, hey, look, we're a little bit different? It seems as though the state is not even presenting a path to allow that. And maybe I'm just, my glass is half empty, but it seems like, you know, we can discuss how Hemet is different, but if there's no opportunity to present that at the state level to adjust the requirements, what does it matter?
If I can comment on that. Your point is, you're not alone in that observation. There's a number of jurisdictions in the state that frankly don't agree with what the state is requiring local government to do. There has been talk in the past about addressing the RENA process. If you recall, recently they had an appeals process. Only 2 jurisdictions got the appeal. The irony of it is because they got the appeal, everybody else's numbers actually went. That being said, the legislative kind of support on many different jurisdictions in Orange County, they're looking in, for example, it's in the process of bringing some legal action up to the state through a voter initiative. And they have some support at the regional level. So that is ongoing. These are the methods that people are looking into. But if I can say, when it relates to the law is the law. It applies until it's changed. And so we're obligated, as any of us, is if the law is stated what it is, we have to comply with that. And we may not agree with that. Obviously, we have to do that until it changes. We can lobby the state and make our points known that you as a legislative body is that you have the right to provide your opinions and choose your course of action, whatever the state's requirements are. It's obviously a conversation that you would have with your legal counsel to talk through the details of that approach. But I think at the end of the day, you're not alone in that conversation, and you'll probably see a number of not just lawsuits related to the process, but some initiatives and other locally government initiated discussions around it.
So perhaps, you know, maybe a parallel effort by the city, it may be of value to be looking at other similar types of or similar cities that are facing the same issues, and just kind of keeping on track with what their issues are, what their concerns are. If there's lawsuits that are going up, do they line up with something that maybe the city may want to partner with? It seems like at an individual level, we may not have a whole lot of opportunity, but combined with others, maybe there's a little bit more that we can do. It just my glass is half full on one side, but half empty on the on the other. Just that if we were to buck the system at all, the state's going to withhold funding, or we're going to be in defiance of the law or whatever else. And so like what rights do we really have as a local jurisdiction? So perhaps there should be some level of effort in reaching out to other cities that are of similar size and circumstances, and building that cohort or building those alliances in case there's an opportunity in the future against the state.
Commissioner Russ Brown, to that point, Cal Cities, which is the new name for the League of California Cities, lobbied heavily this past year, unsuccessfully. So you had a whole consortium represented by the league and very experienced lobbyists, and they basically got nowhere. So yeah, that's just another part of the exasperation.
Yeah, well, I guess that's why you have for the first time you have more people leaving California than coming into California. So it just, I mean, from a local control, local jurisdiction perspective, I think it's important that we continue that path and that effort, regardless of past challenges and hurdles, because ultimately, if we are to make any inroads, it's not going to be the city of Hemet versus the state. It's going to be a whole bunch of folks versus the state.
So I have a question. You went through the plan to meet the RETA numbers pretty quick on the PowerPoint. I saw you had a plan to get there by 2029, correct? So, I mean, the numbers are there. They're black and white. They look like numbers on the page, but what does Hemet look like in 2029? Are we talking about apartment buildings that are 5 stories? I mean, have you done any modeling to show us what Hemet would look like in 2029?
We have not done any modeling for that, but these sites that we have identified are ones that are currently vacant, but currently residentially zoned. So as it stands right now, they are able to accommodate for those additional units to be added on.
So we're only talking about single family dwellings or duplexes or something like that?
No, we're not.
Okay.
It's going to be a variety of that. And a case in point is, remember that your existing policy that exists today allows that development. So if you look at your general plan and your zoning code, what you have existing policy would permit the development of these type of units. And when we look at things such as affordability tend to be in apartment units and other things, your code is going to dictate what those actual heights are, and those actually exist. When we talk about single family and all of that, the whole spectrum is going to be within your plan because it's already articulated in your general plan. We just have to look at the affordability of those that will change over time that we don't know at this point.
So we're not looking at changing any of our codes to meet this by 2029? No?
Other than other than looking at design standards that may preclude development. So if there's a constraint that we identify, say heights or something that says we can't build units if we require everything to be 20 feet in maximum height, then we would look at those and amend your code accordingly to accommodate.
And I would just add to that, and other than those changes to our code, which will be necessitated by changes in state law, which as we've talked about, we're constantly having to update these provisions of our zoning code. So I don't expect that to stop over the next 8 years.
Okay. Just trying to get a feel for what it looks like in 2029 here.
Sure, and as it was presented, the current proposal does not have any zoning changes incorporated into the design itself. So we're just keeping all the zoning as is today, as you see them today. We're not making any changes to them.
I know we had the discussion before, but I need to have my memory refreshed. When the government looks at breaks out the map and they determine the demographics of the cities and towns and say this is the units, and what determines those units? What makes the units the way they are for this town versus the town next to us? Is it income? Is it the population? Is it what determines that unit number? And can that be changed in the next, after these 8 years?
If I understand your questions, you're saying, how do we determine the RENA allocation by those income categories?
Right, so the 4,000 units?
Right. There's a SCAG. So what happens is the state says, we have an anticipated growth need for these metropolitan planning organizations, SCAG in our case. 1.3, and this is true, 1.3 million units of housing growth. Now, NPO, you go and look at all the jurisdictions within the SCAG region and slice those pie slices by each jurisdiction. So SCAG is tasked with creating the methodology that determines what those pie slices are and how those income categories are allocated to the different jurisdictions. So we have, and the actual methodology is available on SCAG's website if you go to the RENA section, so you can take a look at it. If you need something curing insomnia, I would recommend it highly. But essentially, it looks at it's a jobs, housing model. We talk about people who retire at the end of their lives. That's a consideration. Birth rates are a consideration. Migration, inflow and outflow of population, availability of infrastructure, transportation, economic conditions, all of those are put in a big bowl, mixed up, and output is these RENA allocations that we see. And so there's also politics involved in as well. And so we had some politicking that went on at SCAG that maybe didn't necessarily use the methodology to its true form, but bottom line is that was the basis to create these RENA numbers. It wasn't just kind of a dartboard, there was a methodology that went with it.
Can you help me understand what a low barrier navigational center is?
Yes, that's a new requirement of the state law. And so if you think of folks that are homeless or transitioning from homeless or potentially to be homeless or have other issues that need services. And so you think of, say, for example, a homeless shelter that has wraparound services. And so the idea of those services, it could be support everything emotional to money and how to find a job and those things. It's the service component that's wrapped around that program. And so the idea is to provide opportunities to have those navigation centers. So it's helping people to navigate out of a situation into a more productive situation.
Any further questions?
Just on the ADUs, which I think, again, not so politically correct, but I think we used to call them granny funds. That's really what we're talking about. On those, and I know that they talked about how we can make those more easily not only accessible for the building of them, but if we can convert those that we know are illegal to have a process of being legal. We mentioned that, or one of you mentioned it, I think, but for HP and our staff, is there, have you run across very many of those? And I know I used to, when I sold real estate, I ran across them and they would not have been permitted.
Correct. What we have found is that in the past, I believe, year, we may have three or four that came through the city as a legal units or total permit. We haven't seen any additional corrections or folks that come in to convert their existing illegal structure to a legal structure. So there's a very small number of actual paper interest in converting the illegal to legal at this point.
And I think that the housing that's been built in the last 10 years or more has the triple car garage feature that had options of those being rooms or, you know, outside rooms, teenage quarters or granny flats. So I just think of that there's a lot of triple car garage units in the valley now that conversion might be an easy conversion to be an AD.
So that is true. The three-car garages can be converted. At least one of the corner space can be converted to the habitation. However, the ADU requirement now also states that you do not have to provide any parking. You could convert your entire garage into an ADU unit. So what that does is it solves one problem, but it creates another.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments? Well, thank you for your presentation. And if there be no further business, we're ready. This meeting is adjourned to the next city council meeting, December 14, 2021. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you.